Let's get started with our afternoon program. We have an afternoon keynote. It's very special. And I just want to introduce this afternoon's proceedings. This morning I said that we were here to be bold, that we had a bold idea, that the idea of bringing the Midwest and putting it back in the center of the American imagination is a worthwhile and indeed very valuable project. And I've singled out John Lauck, who you heard perform earlier this morning, and I think the people, the scholars who are here are delivering on that boldness. But bold ideas don't happen unless you have very generous people who share the vision. And we're really lucky in West Michigan. We have such gratitude for the people in West Michigan who share our vision to build a civil society that's very responsive to the needs of this community and also to our imaginations. And we have a very special guest here this afternoon that I want to point out. Ralph Hauenstein, thank you so much for being here at 103. It's great to see you here. I've said ever since I began as director of the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies that Ralph inspires what we do at the Hauenstein Center, and Bono topped me when he came into town and said, "Ralph's a cool cat." In addition to Ralph, for this particular program, I'd like to thank the Earhart Foundation in Ann Arbor and the Kate and Richard Walters Foundation in Grand Rapids for their very generous support for this program. And also, I would like to acknowledge the Russell Kirk Center and Annette Kirk as a partner for this conference. Thank you so much to all of you who've made this conference possible. And now it is my pleasure to bring Joe Hogan forward, my colleague at the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies. Joe is the program manager of our Common Ground Initiative. Joe?
Thanks, Gleaves. This afternoon, we're very pleased to have a keynote speaker who studies history, but in so many ways has helped make it here in West Michigan and in the Midwest. Hank Meijer is co-chairman and CEO of Meijer Incorporated. He's the grandson of Hendrik Meijer, the founder of Meijer Stores, is vice chairman of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, serves on the boards of Fifth Third Bank, the Kettering Foundation, the Food Marketing Institute, and the National Constitution Center. Hank is a graduate of the University of Michigan with a degree in English and has studied history extensively. He is the biographer of the great bipartisan political leader, Arthur Vandenberg. He is the executive director of the only major documentary about Vandenberg and is here with us tonight to discuss Vandenberg's work in bipartisanship in the Midwest. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thanks, Joe. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm in love with the idea of this conference. I just Gleaves, fabulous. For those of it, I didn't have a title for this coming in, but we'll talk about it later. But let's let the title be the best. Those of you who are familiar with Sinclair Lewis. And for those of us who take seriously the notion of the Midwest as the American heartland, this conference is a really bracing invitation to challenge the stereotypes that can reduce this part of the world to a cliche. The stereotypes and contradictions of this part of the world, the tension inherent in what it means to be a Midwesterner, may be nowhere better exemplified than in the unlikely odyssey of Arthur Vandenberg. The senator who dominated the American delegation at the founding of the United Nations, who engineered passage of the Marshall Plan, who created the FDIC and wrote the resolution enabling NATO, who embodied bipartisan foreign policy in the crucial years at the outset of the Cold War, was born about 6 blocks from where we gather today. He was born in 1884, just months before another notable Midwesterner, author Sinclair Lewis. And in the intersection of their lives lies one of the great tensions that defines this region. Half a century later, A daughter of a friend of Senator Vandenberg's was married another few blocks from here to the son of another prominent Midwesterner and fellow Senator, Robert Taft of Ohio. The Vandenbergs hosted the Tafts on that occasion, and in the intersection of their lives, Arthur Vandenberg and Robert Taft, lies what is perhaps the other defining tension of the heartland. The first was cultural, the ongoing disconnect between coastal arbiters of art and society and the inhabitants of our land between the mountain ranges. And the second was political, a debate about what role America should play in the world. And that's a debate that's very much with us today, and one in which I think geography looks increasingly irrelevant. In Vandenberg's case, the first one was more personal and the second was more civic. Arthur Vandenberg was, like his New Deal nemesis, Harry Hopkins of Iowa, and it's fun because this is like an invitation to name drop people from the Midwest, the son of a harness maker. He dropped out of the University of Michigan to work as a reporter for the Grand Rapids Herald. He was a frustrated writer. He'd published half a dozen sort of Horatio Alger, O. Henry-esque short stories before turning to a more ambitious project, a study of his hero, Alexander Hamilton, that he called the greatest American. In 1922, as he pecked out a second book on Hamilton, Sinclair Lewis published his second novel to rather greater acclaim. This was coming on the heels of his sensational Main Street and was seen as another biting critique of Midwestern life. Babbitt was an account of the shallow adventures of a middle-aged, middle-brow striver. George Babbitt was a booster, a progressive enough Republican, a proud and somewhat vainglorious resident of a middle-sized Midwestern city. Lewis called the place Zenith. He could have called it Grand Rapids. Arthur Vandenberg recoiled at the description of George Babbitt. This was close to his Midwestern bones, close to all that he cherished about his hometown and its inhabitants, his readers, his advertisers, his friends. In the actual Grand Rapids, Vandenberg had become editor and publisher of the town's Republican newspaper, the Herald. And he refused to accept backwater status. Why, a few years later, Colonel McCormick of the Chicago Tribune, who of course waged a decades-long war with Washington, even suggested that the nation's capital ought to be relocated to Grand Rapids as a more representative American city. Vandenberg was ambitious and restless, and in the 1920s he was no longer the wunderkind editor of Midwestern journalism that he was when he became editor of the Herald in 1906 at the age of 21. He was a middle-aged, middle-brow burgher with pretensions to literature and in demand as an after-dinner speaker for the service clubs. In Republican circles, though, he was making his influence felt. He had supplied phrasing, unshared idealism is a menace, that Henry Cabot Lodge employed in arguing for reservations to the League of Nations Covenant in 1919. He had written Warren Harding's key speech on foreign policy. He appears even to have coined the Harding campaign slogan that has grated on the ears of editors and grammarians ever since, "Let's return to normalcy." When he looked in the mirror, what he wanted to see was not George Babbitt, but Alexander Hamilton, the dashing prodigy from a remote corner of the continent who helped to create a country. The Lewis character, Babbitt, tapped a fund of intellectual contempt for the pieties of the middle class. For H.L. Mencken and other social critics, he provided a shared reference and an easy target for all that was boring and banal in American culture. The name itself entered the language as shorthand for Midwestern mediocrity. If you were H.L. Mencken, you had a new term to talk about, the bourgeoisie, as he called it. When Arthur Vandenberg looked in the mirror, he wanted to see a prominent young editor, a Republican power broker, an eloquent spokesman for the sort of rugged nationalism that could easily be confused with isolationism. He wanted to be a speechwriter for presidents, a thoughtful author, a future U.S. senator. But what he saw reminded him in darker moments of George Babbitt, a character with, as Lewis wrote, some genius of authentic love for his neighborhood, his city, his clan. Babbitt, like Vandenberg, was a cigar-smoking man of the service club luncheon, quote, given to high oratory and high principles, unquote. As Lewis put it, he enjoyed the sound of his own vocabulary and the warmth of his own virtue. And Lewis had the gall to name Babbitt's supercilious son Theodore Roosevelt Babbitt. This was near sacrilege to the editor, for whom TR was a beacon of vigorous Americanism, whose bunting-draped portrait hung behind the editor's desk. And despite that hero worship, Vandenberg was, as Lewis described Babbitt, an organization Republican who refused back in 1912 to bolt with the bull moose and instead supported William Howard Taft. Vandenberg used his editorials to promote modestly progressive civic initiatives, such as the Good Citizens League strove for in Babbitt's mythical zenith. Grand Rapids, the name itself was zenith-like in its hyperbole. Vandenberg began to worry, as Babbitt did, that he could never be anything but what he was then. In 1925, H.L. Mencken reviewed the memoir of Vandenberg's good friend Milton McCrae, a name now forgotten, but he was the head of the Scripps Howard newspaper chain. Just the year before, Vandenberg had proposed that the University of Michigan award an honorary degree to McCrae, who he described as one of the leading figures in American journalism. In fact, wrote Vandenberg, McCrae, a Detroit native and lifelong Midwesterner, had just published his life story, which Vandenberg called a tremendously fascinating chronicle. Mencken had not seen fit to review Vandenberg's Hamilton books, and that was probably just as well, for he observed of McCrae, he is, as he depicts himself, Babbitt to the life, the perfect Rotarian. Most of his sheets are published in small towns, and those that are not still bear a small town air. Not only that, Mencken wrote, but McCrae had adorned his memoir with letters from presidents of the United States. This too cut close to the bone for the Herald editor, whose biography of Hamilton opened with an endorsement from another one-time and truly mediocre Midwestern editor, Warren Harding. In October 1925, the author of Babbitt, Sinclair Lewis, led off Mencken's American Mercury magazine with an essay on self-conscious America. Had Vandenberg read it closely, he might have discerned in Red Lewis a closet conservative. But it was a conservatism born of reaction to any facile notion of human improvement, not just to the boosterism of Zenith or Grand Rapids. Hence, Lewis declared, to the question of all Sunday newspapers and teachers' associations, what is the matter with America and how shall we do something about it? There is one final answer. There are too many people who ask, what is the matter with America, and then dash out and try to do something about it. Another writer in the same issue of American Mercury was more provocative. Arthur O'Dane saw Babbitt motivated by a conviction that it is humanly possible, nay, easily feasible, for a man to be somewhat other than he is. O'Dane was the pen name of an editorial writer named Reuben Maury, who later became, and increasingly in a conservative way, one of the most prolific editorial writers of the 20th century at the New York Daily News. Arthur Vandenberg believed in self-improvement. Why, look at the great Hamilton. Vandenberg wrote a column for the Herald that he tried to syndicate called What Makes a Man. He would walk to work from his house on Morris Avenue to the Herald office downtown with his eyes fixed straight ahead, setting mental exercises for himself, trying to work up a passage of verse in his memory. O'Dane would have scoffed. Of Babbitt, he wrote, the God he affected to admire had been exceeding generous toward the nation of which Zenith was a conspicuous adornment. Mr. Babbitt, at 45, saw himself not least among business captains and kings of Zenith. The Babbitt-baiters laughed at his pretensions. He thought, concluded O'Dane, he became automatically a gentleman when he dressed like one, a scholar by reading Literary Digest. George Babbitt's small city delusions were fostered everywhere, O'Dane wrote, by a concerted and continuous gas attack from press, pulpit, rostrum, and blackboard. The contempt was palpable, and Vandenberg could not abide it. He was only 41, yet far from least among the captains and kings of his Midwestern city. So he wrote an editorial. Let us save the best of Babbitt, he wrote. He decried the way a lot of intellectual snobs, Mencken among them, have been preening their own rarefied wisdom at the expense of this poor yokel. Babbitt has been buried beneath the scornful contempt of these metropolitan sophisticates who pity his confinement to the lesser realities of life. Vandenberg wrote of Rotarians in New York who spoke out for their maligned Midwestern brethren, of a former Michigan governor addressing Kiwanians on the virtues of the Noonday Luncheon Club movement, tying together the social structure of America with ideals of unity and justice. When I thought about that phrase, tying together the social structure of America, thought about the book that 80 years later the sociologist Robert Putnam wrote. He was an Ohio native and he has a new book out talking about the loss of community. And I think there may be some connection there. The very expressions of uplift that characterized Vandenberg's editorials, his cherished notions of what makes a man, where he borrowed quotes from everybody from Emerson to Edison, were to Mencken, who scorned newspapermen as easily as he did preachers and salesmen, objects of ridicule. Babbitt has a right to strike back, Vandenberg wrote. Without him, this would be a sodden land. He is happy and satisfied to be a part of his own hometown and to strive with his neighbors to make the old hometown a little better and a little cleaner and a little healthier. He is worth 1,000 of his supercilious detractors who puff themselves horrendously on the winds of their own vanity. Save us, Vandenberg continued, from a land that is all New York. Save us from a society that is all Mencken and Sinclair Lewis. Give us Babbitt at his best, interested in his home, living with his own wife, striving to educate his children, helping along his church, still believing in a just God, loving his country and his flag. Arthur Vandenberg was all for the zip that George Babbitt prized. Where it would take him was highly uncertain, but for another decade, he was spared the society of that inky charlatan, as he called him, Sinclair Lewis. Vandenberg's strident defense was his plea to see in George Babbitt more than a caricature. Behind his knee-jerk reaction, the Herald editor was himself a more complex figure, all the more sensitive to stereotyping and hardly representative of the Noonday Luncheon Club movement. This was Vandenberg at a cultural crossroads. The writer of short stories, the would-be senator, was fighting a rearguard action in defense of his home and readers and presumptive constituents, in defense of his life so far. This was the editor whose morning shave had been interrupted by a ringing telephone. "Mr. Vandenberg," the caller began, "I happened into the Herald office last night and I saw something you should know about." The man refused to give his name as he continued, "I represent a 100% American organization, and we don't like certain kinds of people." I have to wonder if this was the Ku Klux Klan, which of course flourished in Michigan as elsewhere in the Midwest in the 1920s. And the voice said, "I discovered you have working for you in your newsroom a man who is of a religion we don't like." "That's enough," Vandenberg grumbled into the mouthpiece. "If you don't have the guts to tell me your name, I have only this to say. That fellow you mentioned has worked for us for a long time. I don't care what his race or religion is or the color of his skin, as long as he continues to do a good job. Good day to you, sir, and don't bother me again." Ultimately, Vandenberg would be spared the company of neither H.L. Mencken nor Sinclair Lewis. However, in the meantime, his notions of civil liberty had advanced beyond the days of World War I, the Great War jingoism, even when the liberty in question was that of Babbitt's chief antagonist, Mencken himself. In 1926, H.L. Mencken challenged a Boston censor by publishing an issue of American Mercury that featured the story of a prostitute. The censor appealed to the United States Post Office, which barred the magazine from the mails. The hat rack case, as it was known, became a national sensation. Mencken assumed that supporters of the First Amendment would rally to his cause. Students and socialists and Sinclair Lewis made vigorous protests, but no groundswell followed. One senator tried to strip the post office of its censorship power, but others shied away. Mencken could understand the politicians' hostility and that of the clergy and other blue stockings he'd managed to offend over the years. But what of his colleagues in the press? Perhaps these were too often the same men against whose mediocrity this champion of press freedom had so exuberantly fulminated. The New York Times and the New York World Midwestern name dropping, the New York World's most influential editor, and that was the Pulitzer paper, was Frank Cobb, who had died just a couple of years before that in 1923, who had started as a young reporter at the Herald. The New York papers voiced support, but others had little sympathy or suspected a publicity stunt. Magazine sales did soar, after all. Mencken sent a mimeographed appeal to editors across the country explaining the gravity of the issue and denying any attempt to capitalize on the publicity. Yet only 2 more newspapers came to his defense, one of them Arthur Vandenberg's Grand Rapids Herald. In 1928, Vandenberg was appointed to the United States Senate. Fast forward to Washington in the throes of the Great Depression. Senator Vandenberg, having become one of Franklin Roosevelt's chief antagonists again and again in legislative battles over the New Deal, reflects a public consensus that the country must steer clear of the foreign intrigues that drew the United States into World War I. He had been a full-throated backer of President Wilson's war to make the world safe for democracy, only to see a cynical peace sow the seeds of future conflict. Franklin Roosevelt had been party to Wilson's tragic follies, and Vandenberg's distrust of FDR was complete. Besides, George Washington's farewell address had warned against foreign entanglements, and that address was Vandenberg's lodestar. The distinguished senator and his wife, Hazel, counted among their good friends in Washington Dorothy Thompson, noted columnist and the most influential female journalist of the day. In a union that would grow beyond tumultuous, Dorothy marries Sinclair Lewis. And Lewis would publish It Can't Happen Here, the novel in which he envisions the upcoming 1936 election as a contest in which a populist demagogue Democrat, read Huey Long, but Lewis, and I think this is important for a regional conference, makes him a New Englander, supplants Franklin Roosevelt and defeats a Midwestern Republican senator to become president. The Republican is fictional, although on page 1 of the novel, Lewis mentions Vandenberg as well as Roosevelt and Hoover as one of the unsuccessful contenders for the office. The populist regime, this is the mid-1930s, becomes a fascist one, jailing dissidents and suppressing freedom. A revolution breaks out in Michigan, of all places, led by the bulky Senator Walter Trowbridge, who was said by Thompson to have been based in large part on Arthur Vandenberg. As a coda to the Lewis connection, it's worth mentioning that on the eve of the publication of It Can't Happen Here in the fall of 1935, Thompson and Lewis, and separately the Vandenbergs, were all making trips to Europe. Dorothy Thompson was en route to Germany, where she was granted an exclusive interview with Adolf Hitler, after which she became an ardent interventionist, sounding an alarm over the Nazi menace. On their journey, the Vandenbergs were met in London by Milton McCrae's daughter, who had married an Englishman after the death of her husband, Vandenberg protege William Alden Smith Jr. The senator's schedule was no provincial tour. Arthur and Hazel visited with H.G. Wells and dined with Lord Beaverbrook, a fellow publisher. Settling into their stateroom for the voyage home, they received an invitation to cocktails from a fellow passenger, Sinclair Lewis. The note expressed the celebrated novelist's admiration for the senator. Hazel was more curious than her wary husband to meet the Nobel Prize winner. From Main Street to Elmer Gantry with Babbitt in between, Vandenberg saw in Lewis a jaded view of American life. Dorothy Thompson had hurried back to New York after interviews with Hitler and Mussolini. Lewis had lingered in England, and he met the Vandenbergs in the ship's lounge. S.L., Sinclair Lewis, S.L. tight, Hazel wrote in her diary. But the surprise was that the two nearly exact contemporaries, the ponderous senator and the acerbic novelist, found much in common. Each was, in his way, a sentimentalist about their shared Midwestern world. Each looked at the unfolding drama of European politics with a jaundiced eye and a worry for America's future. It Can't Happen Here was just arriving in bookstores as martinis were shaken in the first-class lounge. Over several days, the Vandenbergs and Lewis wrote Hazel, just a hilarious, happy time. Upon their return, the Vandenbergs departed for Michigan, Red Lewis was so drunk that he had to be hospitalized, but their unlikely friendship would continue. In the 1940 election, Vandenberg had been among the early favorites. He was expected to contest the nomination with a young prosecutor from New York by way of Owasso, Michigan, Thomas Dewey, and perhaps a dark horse freshman senator from Ohio with a famous name, Robert Taft. Instead, with the outbreak of war in Europe and a growing clamor for American support of Great Britain and other beleaguered European democracies, yet another Midwesterner, the charismatic Wendell Willkie, a New York lawyer by way of Elwood, Indiana, outflanked the senators and swept to the nomination. Vandenberg had come of age when Teddy Roosevelt, the hero of his teenage years, had picked Taft's father, William Howard Taft, as his successor. It was in Grand Rapids at a Lincoln Day dinner in 1908 that William Howard Taft had declared his candidacy for president. Vandenberg stuck by the party's choice 4 years later when the restless Roosevelt came out of retirement to challenge Taft and then bolt from the party to run on his progressive Bull Moose ticket. When Bob Taft arrived in the Senate in 1939, he and Arthur Vandenberg were aligned in their opposition to both the New Deal and to American intervention in the looming European war. By intellect and hard work, Taft quickly established himself as a formidable force on Capitol Hill. Arthur Vandenberg succeeded William Borah as the party's leading isolationist. Robert Taft set his sights on the domestic agenda, bringing new energy to the fight against Roosevelt's vast expansion of federal power. World War II changed the political landscape for both men, as it did for the rest of the country. With Franklin Roosevelt moving from Professor New Deal to Dr. Win the War, and the country uniting in its mission to defeat the Axis powers, debate was muted. In 1943, establishment Republicans needed to patch up their 1940 rupture when Wendell Willkie had taken the party by the storm, even though he'd been a Democrat just 18 months before. Party leaders met 200 miles north of here in what I would suggest is the most remote setting in our history for a gathering of so many important political figures. 41 senators, governors, congressmen took the ferry to Mackinac Island and took over the Grand Hotel for Labor Day weekend to plan their platform for 1944. Their goal was to paper over the schism between interventionists and isolationists, between Willkie and Taft, that could once again split the party down the middle. In what looked like a nod to the isolationists, Vandenberg led the Foreign Policy Committee. The group met in a small room at the Grand Hotel. After grueling hours of deliberation, Taft stepped out to ask the manager for a bottle of scotch and a bottle of bourbon. They were having some trouble reaching agreement, the dour Ohioan hinted, and maybe some lubrication could help. The result was a compromise that Taft and Willkie could both live with, calling for American participation in a post-war organization of nations. Taft would not have shared the observation of Liz Carpenter, a young reporter covering the conference, who literally eavesdropped on Vandenberg as he buttonholed other Republicans to engineer the compromise. Carpenter recalled Vandenberg's tactic of strolling with another conferee to the far end of what was said to be the world's longest porch. There, she said, where the terrace ended with a view of the Straits of Mackinac, was where American isolationism ended as well. In 2 days, the party that had torpedoed the League of Nations charted a new course. When I succeeded in putting 49 prima donnas together at Mackinac, Vandenberg crowed to Henry Luce, I discovered the necessary formula. In 1945, with an Allied victory on the horizon, Taft and Vandenberg found their paths beginning to diverge. Taft had never shaken his conviction that the greatest threat to the country was the centralization of power in Washington. Vandenberg, equally vocal in his hostility to the New Deal and federal power, came to see the Soviet regime in Moscow as a greater threat than the Roosevelt regime in Washington. And Taft was, in a sense, more conservative than his father, who had been an advocate for American engagement in the world. Former President Taft had actually supported Wilson's campaign for American membership in the League of Nations until, and this is going back to 1919, then editor Vandenberg challenged him on the occasion of a Taft speech in Grand Rapids to seek reservations that would protect American interests and ensure passage by the Senate. Vandenberg and Taft were emerging, though neither had even ranking status on prominent committees, as the twin poles of power among Senate Republicans. Taft set the party's domestic agenda. Vandenberg was its voice in foreign policy. Taft may have sensed a growing distance between them when Vandenberg, on the eve of FDR's journey to Yalta for a summit with Stalin and Churchill, gave what some called the speech heard round the world in January 1945. In it, the one-time isolationist Vandenberg called for a first-ever peacetime treaty among the soon-to-be victorious Allies. The proposal centered on the demilitarization of Germany, assuring security for the Soviet Union and other victims of German aggression. This was an entangling alliance for sure. Taft, along with the Chicago Tribune, may have been taken aback, but this was a prescription for future peace that war-weary Americans hungered for. Then Roosevelt, rather reluctantly, but in the name of not repeating Wilson's mistake in trying to ram the League of Nations through Congress with insufficient Senate support, appointed Vandenberg as a delegate to the United Nations Conference in San Francisco. Then Roosevelt died, and Harry Truman knew he needed Arthur Vandenberg. In San Francisco, the delegates experienced firsthand Soviet intransigence. Such was the temper of the time that they brought back to Washington a charter that won overwhelming approval. Bob Taft voted with the majority. Taft went along as well when President Truman asserted American intentions to succeed Great Britain in providing aid to pro-Western Greek and Turkish governments when the British could no longer afford to. Truman went further. Vandenberg had encouraged him, though this is a quote that has never been verified but often repeated, told Truman that if he wanted this aid, he would have to scare the hell out of the American people. That quote has never been documented, but it probably catches the substance of what Vandenberg said. And Vandenberg went further than either Truman or Taft or Vandenberg would have wished, and called for aid to peoples anywhere resisting totalitarian aggression. But when Truman's Secretary of State, George Marshall, proposed a massive aid program to rebuild Europe, many Republicans blanched. Even as Vandenberg took pains to pare down the package and vet its particulars in one of the most long-lasting, far-reaching committee efforts in Senate history, Taft went along reluctantly, challenging the appropriations at every turn. Even as Vandenberg felt a growing confidence in his own convictions, the fragile Republican consensus was fraying. Was the party's foreign policy leader getting just a little too cozy with a Democratic administration that depended on GOP support? The president was asking them to approve shipping vast sums of money overseas. As Vandenberg acknowledged in a letter to his wife, evidently I am to have some degree of trouble with Bob Taft. So be it. Truman looked easy to beat in 1948, but this time the nomination would go, as it had in 1944, to Thomas Dewey. Meanwhile, Vandenberg and Taft, fresh off recapturing the Congress in 1946, would run the Senate. For Vandenberg, who had negotiated with the Soviets in San Francisco and then again at peace conferences in London and Paris, the Cold War was up close and personal. For Taft, it was all too much an excuse to divert attention from the domestic agenda. For Vandenberg, it was clear that economic aid alone was not sufficient to contain the Soviet threat in Europe. Working with the State Department, in the person of Undersecretary Robert Leavitt, he typed out in his apartment what became the Vandenberg Resolution, enabling American participation in a permanently entangling new alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This, for Taft, was a bridge too far. Meanwhile, Vandenberg was lionized in the press. In May 1948, Richard Rovere, in a Harper's piece entitled "The Unassailable Vandenberg," rather sarcastically suggested that Republicans in 1948 call off their primary season and nominate Vandenberg as the surest candidate for President of the world. No American politician, he argued, stood higher in the eyes of his fellows. His prestige is global, Rovere wrote. The press of the world, except that of Russia, hurries to report everything he says. Here at home, he is beyond reproach from his friends, and by the magic of bipartisanship, beyond judgment by his enemies. His worst enemies were the communists, although the McCormick Press, the Chicago Tribune, unrepentantly isolationist, sometimes vied for that honor. On the eve of the 1948 convention, Vandenberg feared an effort by Taft and his allies to challenge a Republican platform that reflected Vandenberg's bid for foreign policy consensus. They might try, he wrote, to upset any sort of enlightened foreign policy and return to the good old days when it took 2 weeks to cross the ocean. Dewey, the front runner for the nomination, fended off a challenge from Taft. Claire Luce begged Van to get into the fight, and Vandenberg was also the favorite of an old friend, Sinclair Lewis. But Vandenberg declined. To Lewis, he replied that such encouragement was more a tribute to his heart than to his head. And Taft, losing to Dewey, was not the worst thing that could have happened, Colonel McCormick said later. It could have been Vandenberg. After Dewey won the nomination, Vandenberg urged him not to appease Taft by picking an isolationist for vice president. Instead, Dewey chose Earl Warren, governor of California, to form a ticket in accord with Vandenberg's views. After Truman upset Dewey and Democrats took back control of Congress, Senate supporters of Vandenberg proposed to oust Taft from his chairmanship of the Republican Policy Committee. Vandenberg was sympathetic, but wanted no open breach with his old ally, even as it was the Taftites who had bedeviled him over the Marshall Plan and NATO. Vandenberg also befriended a new congressional protege from his home district, young Jerry Ford. Time and again, over presidential appointments as well as policies, Taft and Vandenberg found themselves at odds. A Washington correspondent survey in 1949 judged Taft to be the most conscientious of senators and Vandenberg as the most statesmanlike. They were the giants of that era in the Senate. As the Senate took up the NATO treaty, Taft came out in opposition. The Taft speech will lengthen the battle because it lends a certain respectability to the opposition, Vandenberg told his wife. He was fighting for the NATO treaty while also seeking renewed funding for the Marshall Plan. Of the battle for the latter, he wrote, "I get so damn sick of that little band of GOP isolationists who are always in the way that I could scream." Now, there was no little irony here, and he knew it. As the debate to fund military aid for new NATO allies dragged on through the summer of 1949, a spot detected on Vandenberg's left lung needed to be removed. He postponed surgery until the fall, working to pass the aid bill. "This is the last of my really big efforts," he wrote. The effort, and it ultimately succeeded, was to defeat the forces of Robert Taft. Taft came to see him in 1950 when he was in Georgetown Hospital recuperating from cancer surgery. The old war horses found broad agreement in their frustration with Truman's executive action in Korea. That fall, Vandenberg was back in Grand Rapids in an upstairs room in his house on Morris Avenue. And without him, Republicans were once again splitting over foreign policy. Taft told Vandenberg he did not want a rift. "Please do not be upset, your word, by anything that appears in the papers involving our relationships," Vandenberg wrote him back. "We have lived through several years of press efforts to put us at odds." Vandenberg lay on his deathbed as a one-time supporter of his, the junior senator from Wisconsin, began to throw around charges of communists in high places in the American government. Taft had no brief for McCarthy, but there was a sense in the party that he was holding his nose while letting McCarthy keep on the attack. But Tail Gunner Joe was attacking not just State Department civil servants and Democrats with false and reckless charges. As Vandenberg, gaunt and cancer-stricken, was in and out of hospitals, McCarthy even went after George Marshall. As the journalist Herbert Agar wrote later, "The complacence of the Senate cannot be explained. The whole of this privileged body of powerful and experienced men seemed to be hypnotized by McCarthy's atrocious talk, or even worse, they seemed to be afraid." He noticed the absence of the great Vandenberg, who, he said, did not scare easily. In 1951, Vandenberg could only hope that General Eisenhower might emerge to wrest the party from what Taft was tolerating. When it became apparent that that was likely to happen, Vandenberg, just weeks before he died, told a reporter, "I feel as though a great load has been lifted from my back. Lest we forget, like Lewis and Taft, Truman and Eisenhower, were also sons of the Midwest. They all had something in common beyond their native region. Each came to rely on the leadership of Arthur Vandenberg, whose journey from booster of Zenith to erstwhile president of the world began and ended right here in the heart of the country. Thank you. Love to just talk with you. I brought along some real low-tech props here. And these are kind of before and after in terms of Vandenberg's career evolution. For some of you from Grand Rapids, this snapshot was given to me by a mutual friend of some of ours. This little girl, this is at Ottawa Beach near Holland, Michigan, is Barb Amberg, who some of you may know. Her family had a cottage near the Vandenbergs. And this was Arthur Vandenberg in the summer of 1939 as one of the leading, William Borah dies in 1940, but Vandenberg has emerged as the most active Senate isolationist. And this is at the Ionia Free Fair, appropriately framed by elephants. And then in the continuing evolution, he was on covers of a number of the magazines, but this is at San Francisco, a Bill of Rights for the World, ? And then this is during the NATO deliberations, or the Marshall Plan, where it says, we either take or surrender leadership. In a sense, for Vandenberg, it was a move from partisan to bipartisan in his own way of thinking about his role. Yes, sir.
I wonder if you would comment on the changing nature of journalism and political editorials, people like Vandenberg and McCormick and the Chicago Tribune, as compared to the role that newspapers are playing now, well, especially in the Midwest, as the political season revs up here.
Well, I don't know if I'm qualified to talk about it, especially for the Midwest, but it's a wonderful question because what strikes me again and again is how in the early years of the century, how important newspapers were. I mean, in a sense, so many political figures from Byrd in Virginia to Capper in Kansas to Chase Osborne in northern Michigan to Vandenberg, these folks all came out, they were all editors and publishers. I mean, that William Allen White in Emporia, Kansas could wield so much influence. At the very least, you almost had a constituency in your community or your market. And then with people like Vandenberg, he would send his editorials all over the country. So they would be reprinted. Your voice could be projected both intensely at a local level and broadly in a way that there's just no counterpart for today. And when Vandenberg was appointed to the Senate, it was a controversial appointment because he had helped elect the governor who ultimately appointed him, but that governor had two former governors who also wished to be appointed on the death of the incumbent Democrat, so the governor was going to take the non-courageous way out and appoint an obscure congressman to be a placeholder for a year and then let Vandenberg and whoever else wanted to run. And Vandenberg thought he had a tacit understanding that he would get the appointment. And he almost didn't until the Detroit News, which was the leading Republican journal in the state, the editor went to the governor and said, you can double-cross Arthur Vandenberg, but you can't double-cross the Detroit News. And so just the power of that, and of course McCormick had such sway, and he and Vandenberg were allies around the isolationist stuff, but Vandenberg favored the St. Lawrence Seaway, which McCormick viewed as a threat to Chicago shipping interests and Mississippi River traffic. And so McCormick would accuse Vandenberg of being a sellout to the British because we'd be surrendering our sovereignty, sharing the seaway with Canada, and all kinds of crazy stuff, which doesn't answer your question. But the power of a community's newspaper to set opinion was so profound. And today, I mean, of course, most newspapers are hollow shells of what they were, and there seems to be we are conscious of a newspaper having a certain political stamp, but nobody states it baldly anymore, and so it's almost kind of, it feels false if the positions are so tepid, except maybe in the Wall Street Journal, that we have to wonder what they think their role is. But thank you. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the Jerry Ford connection. Ford's father had been chairman of the Republican Party. Was there significant interchange between Jerry Ford? There's only about a 3-year period.
Yeah.
His election. Was there significant discussion, philosophical approach? I mean, were they really good, or was it the normal senator to represent?
I wouldn't want to overplay it. It wasn't that close. It was when, in Grand Rapids, there was, of course, a local reform movement that challenged our local kingmaker and very corrupt politician, Frank McKay. And Jerry Ford's dad had been one of the leaders of that reform movement. But Vandenberg at that point had been in Washington for nearly 20 years and was really not engaged in the local political machinations. But his 5th district, at that time congressman, was Bart Yonkman, who was unrepentant isolationist. And he and Vandenberg, after World War II, were increasingly at odds. And Vandenberg didn't want to promote opposition to his incumbent congressman, who also happened to be a neighbor. But Jerry Ford came to him and received sort of tacit blessing. He said, I'm not going to do a public endorsement, but I hope you win, kind of thing. And then when they went to, when Jerry and Betty went to Washington, they were guests of Arthur and Hazel at Arthur's next birthday party. I mean, just the 4 of them dining together at the Shoreham Hotel. So they quickly developed a warm relationship. It was never really close because it was, like you said, such a short span of time. Now, one of those wonderful unverified bits that you hear about sometimes when you're doing research is the recollection of an elderly lady who's now at the Clark home, who attended Lafayette School, which became Vandenberg School, and she recalls Jerry, and it's almost hard to picture, but wonderful to picture. It was right around the corner from where Vandenberg lived on Morris Avenue, and she recalls Jerry Ford pushing Arthur, who was increasingly bedridden and could not walk easily, in a wheelchair in a visit to the school, like for a school assembly before Christmas or something in 1950. And I have there was no news coverage of that or anything, and that's the school that became Vandenberg School. But they definitely had a warm social relationship in the brief time that they overlapped, and President Ford was later regarded Vandenberg as one of his real political heroes. Yes, sir.
Your story about the relationship between Sinclair Lewis and Vandenberg is fascinating. And to back up your point about how Sinclair Lewis kind of turned out to be actually a champion of the Midwest, if I remember correctly, and it can't happen here, the real opponent of fascism is a small-town Midwestern editor.
Is he Midwestern? I couldn't remember. It's Doremus Jessup. Yeah. Yes. Well, and it gets back to the gentleman's question in the back about the influence of newspapers, and there's this wonderful. But Lewis has this wonderful aside where he said that the regime began rounding up jailing newspaper editors except for those of the Hearst chain, which I guess was viewed as a toady of the regime.
You mentioned the Taft and together, that they agreed on, again, Truman, and could you explain that, and the Korean War? What was the problem there?
Well, with the Korean War, famously, Truman called it a police action. And so there was a question of how deeply, and this is not an area that I've researched deeply because it was right at the end of Vandenberg's life, but it was a police action, and a lot of people in Congress felt like they had not been properly consulted, that we had committed troops with kind of last minute notice that we're going to do this, and there should have been appropriate congressional consultation. So that it was one more example of executive action not considering Congress's prerogative. Yeah. Yes, sir.
You know, this conference, we're talking about Midwestern history, using it in several different ways. You're talking about a man who was from the Midwest. Is there a way, or how, would you speculate or talk about what characteristics he had that you might identify as Midwestern? So other than being born here,
Yeah.
who was he and in what ways was he Midwestern?
Yeah, that's really has to be at the heart of so much of what we're thinking about here. No, I know. I mean, it's a baffling question because, I mean, we're not. You know, it's not like Southerners who can define ourselves by accents or by antebellum experience or something like that. But it is a part of the country that was, in many respects, other than its very significant fact of ethnic representation, for example, Michigan having the largest Polish immigrant population in Vandenberg's constituency, but it viewed itself as rather remote from the oceans. So historically there had been that thread of isolationism, although I hate to belabor that too much because that was spread around the country, and you can find plenty of exceptions here. In a very superficial way, I think it's like if you are born here and come back to die here, there's a sense that you've never really left, and I don't know what that says, but it's I am totally stymied trying to answer that question. I mean, we can start naming virtues, but why? But I would not want to deprive a New Englander or a Californian of those virtues. But that's why the Babbitt thing is so interesting, because that's kind of two sides of the coin. There are certain sort of homely attentions to the town and to the sense of community that seem to get attenuated and we have our own major metropolitan areas, but seem to be more attenuated in coastal areas that are maybe perceived as more transient as well as more metropolitan. But I hate to think that we have a monopoly on those virtues, but I think maybe they're emblematic of this region.
One last question. Yes.
You mentioned that Harry Hopkins was nemesis. I wondered if you could talk more about what the relations might have been and maybe what he thought of perhaps someone like Herbert Hoover or Henry Wallace, a couple other Westerners.
Oh my gosh, yes. Well, of course, Hopkins was in such a great way a driver of so much New Deal activity, and particularly some of the more highly politicized and controversial elements of the New Deal. So to the extent that Vandenberg is fighting those things, he and Hopkins are bumping into each other. Same way with Wallace, who when he is Secretary of Agriculture, he's got the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which this whole idea of government deciding that you ought to slaughter a lot of pigs or whatever to raise the price of pigs was anathema to a lot of Republicans. And then Wallace becomes vice president and then Secretary of Commerce. And that actually resulted, as Secretary of Commerce, in a showdown. Vandenberg is with Secretary of State Burns. Vandenberg and his Democratic counterpart on foreign relations, Tom Connolly, are in Paris for much of 1946. Vandenberg was reelected coming home the day before the election in November. He'd been in Paris most of that time at the foreign ministers' conferences with Truman and Burns, wanting to make sure they had the Senate represented, and really is a unique diplomatic role in our history for a legislator. And he and Burns are over negotiating with the Soviets, and there's the famous incident where Wallace is addressing a crowd in Madison Square Garden in which he is accusing the administration of being too hostile to the Soviets. And he is said to have shown a draft of the speech to Truman. Truman apparently didn't look at it or gave it a cursory glance and said, fine. And all hell breaks loose when Vandenberg and Burns are negotiating with the Russians over peace treaties on the Eastern European states and stuff. And here comes this thing from an administration cabinet member saying we're being too hard on the Russians in our negotiations. And so Vandenberg and Burns get on the horn with Truman and say, we can only have one Secretary of State at a time. And Truman fires Wallace. So that was a big moment there. Vandenberg went to Washington hoping to work with Hoover. Hoover was not, by all accounts, a deft politician. And so as the economy's collapsing, he's really befuddled. He did not know how to work well with Congress. And Vandenberg, as a young Turk freshman senator, prone to compromise, tried to get Hoover and Congress to work together on trade agreements and any number of things. And Hoover just wanted to do it his own way and really frustrated Vandenberg. So they were would-be allies, and certainly they were ideologically in sync a lot of the time, but they were never close at all.
Thank you very much, Hank.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you.
Now, I see Don Lovers walking out the door, but I'm about to acknowledge him. I want to say, when I was listening to Hank, first of all, Hank, thank you very much for such profoundly insightful scholarship and insights into a Midwestern leader who really had a profound impact on the world. And as I was listening to you, I thought how difficult it is to achieve common ground. You need really talented, skilled, well-experienced people to do so. This room has several people in it who have supported the Hauenstein Center's Common Ground initiative significantly in a variety of ways. And I would just like to acknowledge, first of all, Hank and I have had some great conversations about furthering our Common Ground initiative, but I also want to point out, of course, Ralph and Karen Loth in the front row here, because she's done so much as vice president at the university to help us with the Common Ground initiative. Annette Kirk, of course, our partner in several ventures, who also shares our commitment because Russell Kirk shared that commitment to finding common ground. And then we have Hillary Snell, who's the chair of our advisory cabinet. I want to thank you, Hillary, for all that you've done to help us with the Common Ground initiative. And Don Lubbers, President Emeritus of Grand Valley State University, the guy I just called out when he was running out into the hall. He's going to get in trouble with us later for that. But he also did so much to help us launch the Common Ground initiative. It was really his, he adopted that program along with us. So we're very, very grateful. So we are very fortunate here in this place in the Middle West to have people who are so committed to following the great example of some of our statesmen who understood what common ground and the importance of common ground is for our democratic institutions to work. Well, with that, we're going to take a break. Let's come back together at 2 o'clock, and we will then have a panel on the iconic Midwest. Thank you.